The Forest of Existentialists. Part 1. The Gate of Mist. The traveler arrives before the forest entrance in the dying light of afternoon, when shadows grow long and the world seems to hold its breath between day and night. There are no signs here, no posted warnings or welcome messages, no carefully maintained trails with wooden markers indicating distance or difficulty. Instead, there stands only a natural archway formed by twisted branches that have grown together over decades, perhaps centuries, creating a threshold that seems to pulse with an ancient, wordless invitation. The gate itself defies easy description. It is not constructed by human hands, yet it possesses an intentionality that mere chance could not have wrought. Two massive oaks have bent toward each other across the years, their uppermost branches intertwining in an embrace that creates a perfect arch some 15 feet above the forest floor. Their bark is weathered to silver gray, scarred by countless seasons, and moss clings to their northern faces in soft, green patches that seem to glow faintly in the dimming light. Beneath this canopy, smaller saplings and elderberry bushes have grown up to fill the spaces, creating walls of living green that frame the entrance on either side. What strikes the traveler most profoundly is not what is present, but what is absent. No gravel path leads into the forest depths. No wooden boardwalk offers safe passage over potentially muddy ground. No interpretive signs explain the flora and fauna that might be encountered within. The absence of these familiar markers of civilization creates a strange vertigo, a sense of standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable. This is not a park designed for casual weekend hikers, nor a preserve managed for public recreation. This is something else entirely, a place that predates such human categorizations and refuses to be tamed by them. The mist that gives this threshold its name begins to gather as the traveler stands in contemplation. It does not pour out from the forest depths like smoke from a chimney, but rather seems to materialize from the air itself, condensing from nothing into wisps of gray-white vapor that curl around the bases of the trees and drift across the unmarked ground. As minutes pass, the mist thickens, obscuring the details of what lies beyond the gate. Trees that were clearly visible moments before fade into suggestion, their trunks becoming ghostly pillars that disappear into an increasingly opaque veil. Standing before this threshold, the traveler experiences what Martin Heidegger would have recognized as the call of being, that fundamental summons that draws human consciousness away from the comfortable familiarity of everyday existence and toward a deeper engagement with the mystery of existence itself. It is not a voice that speaks in words, but rather a resonance that seems to emerge from the very ground beneath one's feet, from the air between the leaves, from the space between heartbeats. It is a call that every human being has heard at some point in their lives, the whisper that suggests there's more to existence than the daily round of work and sleep, consumption and conversation, the endless cycle of tasks that fill our hours but somehow leave us feeling empty. Yet, this call does not come without cost. To answer it requires leaving behind the well-mapped territory of the familiar world, with its established routines and predictable challenges. The traveler knows that beyond this gate lies not a pleasant nature walk with clearly marked trails and emergency call boxes, but a journey into uncertainty. There are no guidebooks for what waits within, no reviews on travel websites, no photographs posted by previous visitors to set expectations. This is a passage into what Heidegger called the there of existence, that fundamental situatedness in being that underlies all our specific experiences, but which we usually manage to avoid confronting directly. The weight of this realization settles over the traveler like the gathering mist itself. To step through this gate is to acknowledge that the comfortable illusions that normally govern daily life, the sense that we know where we are going, that we understand what we're doing, that the world is fundamentally safe and comprehensible, are indeed illusions. Beyond the gate lies not answers, but deeper questions, not resolution, but intensification of the fundamental mystery of existence. As the traveler stands in this liminal space, neither fully committed to entering nor ready to turn back, the familiar world behind begins to feel increasingly distant and insubstantial. The parking lot where the car sits cooling, ticking as its engine settles, seems like something from a dream. The city with its bustling streets and bright shop windows, the office with its meetings and deadlines, the apartment with its carefully arranged furniture and stack of unread books. All of it fades in importance before this threshold moment. This is what Heidegger meant when he spoke of authenticity, requiring a break from the self, that mode of being in which we lose ourselves in social roles and expectations, in what one does rather than what I choose. The Gate of Mist represents a moment of potential awakening, a chance to step away from the predetermined paths that society has laid out and venture into the unknown territory of one's own authentic existence. The mist continues to thicken as these thoughts unfold, and now the traveler can see perhaps 10 feet into the forest before the gray veil becomes impenetrable. Somewhere in that obscured space, a branch creaks, a leaf falls, the sound of the outside world, distant traffic, the hum of power lines, the occasional airplane passing overhead, grows muffled and indistinct. The forest is asserting its own acoustic environment, creating a bubble of silence that seems to expand with each moment of stillness. The traveler's breathing becomes more conscious, more deliberate. Each inhalation draws an air that tastes of earth and moss, of decomposing leaves and growing things. Each exhalation sends a small puff of warmth into the cool evening air. These simple biological functions, normally so automatic as to be invisible, become suddenly significant. This is embodied existence at its most basic level. The simple fact of being a breathing, sensing creature standing at the boundary between known and unknown. Time seems to stretch and compress simultaneously. How long has the traveler been standing here? Minutes? Hours? The ordinary temporal markers by which we organize our days lose their grip in this place outside the normal flow of scheduled activities. There is no appointment to keep beyond this moment, no deadline pressing forward from the future, no urgent task left undone in the past. There's only this, standing, breathing, contemplating, feeling the pull of something larger than the self. Yet the call that emanates from beyond the gate is not merely an invitation to contemplation. It is also a challenge, a test of courage that every authentic existence must eventually face. For to enter the forest means accepting responsibility for one's own choices in a way that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. It means recognizing that we are not simply products of our circumstances, victims of fate, or passive recipients of whatever life happens to deliver to us. Instead, it means embracing what Heidegger called our thrownness, the fact that we find ourselves existing without having chosen to exist, but that from this thrown condition, we must nonetheless choose how to be. The twisted branches of the gate seem to frame not just a physical entrance, but a philosophical threshold. Beyond lies a space where the comfortable certainties that normally insulate us from existential anxiety lose their power. The traveler senses that to pass through this archway is to accept a kind of homelessness from which there may be no return, not a physical homelessness, but a spiritual one, a permanent exile from the naive confidence that characterizes those who have never seriously questioned the fundamental assumptions underlying their existence. As the mist swirls and the light continues to fade, the traveler faces the essential human choice that existentialists have long recognized as the cornerstone of authentic existence: the choice to embrace uncertainty and responsibility, or to retreat into the false security of predetermined roles and unexamined assumptions. The Gate of Mist stands open, patient and impassive, neither urging nor discouraging, simply offering itself as possibility. In this moment of decision, the traveler experiences what Heidegger called the moment of vision, a temporal instant in which the past, present, and future converge in a single point of authentic choice. The comfortable habits of the past, the pressing concerns of the present, and the imagined futures all fall away, leaving only this: the pure possibility of stepping forward into the unknown, guided by nothing more than the courage to embrace one's own existence fully. The call of being grows stronger as darkness gathers, echoing not from any particular direction, but seeming to emerge from existence itself, from the fundamental fact that there is something rather than nothing, and that consciousness has somehow emerged to contemplate its own mysterious presence in the world. It is a call that no philosophy can fully explain, no science can completely analyze, no religion can definitively interpret. It is simply there, waiting to be answered or ignored, accepted or denied. The traveler takes a deep breath, feeling the cool mist against their skin, and prepares to choose. Part 2. The silence that speaks. The first steps beyond the Gate of Mist are tentative. Each footfall a small act of faith placed upon ground that yields slightly underfoot, carpeted with decades of fallen leaves that have composted into a soft, spongy layer of organic matter. The traveler moves forward perhaps 10 paces, then 20, And with each step inward, the sounds of the external world begin to retreat, like a tide drawing back from shore. At first, the change is subtle. The distant hum of traffic that had provided an almost subliminal backdrop to consciousness gradually diminishes, not all at once, but by degrees, as if someone were slowly turning down the volume on the outside world. The occasional airplane passing overhead becomes more muffled, its mechanical drone filtered through the thickening canopy of leaves and mist. Even the wind had been audible as it moved through the twisted branches of the gate now takes on a different quality as it encounters the denser forest ahead. Softer, more diffuse, less directional. By the time the traveler has moved 30 yards into the forest, the transformation is complete. The sounds of civilization have not simply faded. They have been erased, as if they never existed at all. It is as though the forest possesses some acoustic property that actively absorbs and neutralizes the vibrations of the human-made world, creating a sphere of silence that expands around the traveler with each step deeper into this green cathedral. But silence, the traveler discovers, is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of something else entirely. What remains in the wake of the familiar world's retreat is a soundscape of startling intimacy and immediacy. The traveler becomes acutely aware of their own breathing, not just the automatic rhythm that usually passes unnoticed, but the entire complex symphony of respiration. The soft whistle of air entering the nostrils, the slight rasp as it passes through the throat, the gentle expansion of the chest, the pause before exhalation, and then the warm rush of breath returning to the world. Each breath becomes a conversation between the self and the atmosphere, a continuous exchange that suddenly seems profound in its simplicity. The heart, too, emerges from its background hum into conscious awareness. The steady lube-dub that normally remains below the threshold of perception now announces itself with unprecedented clarity. The traveler can feel each beat not just in the chest, but throughout the body, in the pulse points of the wrists and throat, in the gentle rhythm that moves through the temples, in the subtle tide that ebbs and flows through consciousness itself. It is as if the forest silence has turned the body into a resonating chamber, amplifying the basic rhythms of life that are usually drowned out by external noise. And then there's the forest's own voice, speaking in a language older than words. The wind that moves through the upper canopy creates a sound unlike anything in the human world. Not the sharp whistle of air moving past buildings or the mechanical whoosh of fans and air conditioners, but something organic and alive, a breathing sound as if the forest itself were a vast lung drawing breath. Sometimes this wind voice rises to what might almost be called a whisper, and sometimes it falls to barely perceptible sighs, but it never entirely stops. It is a continuous exhalation of the living world, the sound of photosynthesis and transpiration, of growth and decay, of time itself made audible. The leaves contribute their own percussion to this natural symphony, not the harsh rattle of dried foliage and autumn wind, but the soft susurrus of living leaves touching and parting, rubbing against each other with a gentle friction of skin against skin. Occasionally, a single leaf detaches and falls, creating a tiny cascade of sound as it brushes past branch and twig before settling onto forest floor with a whisper so soft it might be imagined. Each falling leaf seems to carry with it a small story of the season, of the tree for which it came, of the countless cycles of growth and decay that have preceded this moment. As the traveler moves deeper into this acoustic cocoon, a strange phenomenon begins to emerge. The profound quiet, so different from the aggressive silence of empty rooms or the oppressive hush of libraries, begins to feel almost overwhelming. It presses in from all sides, not as an absence but as a presence, dense and expectant, waiting for something that never quite arrives. The traveler finds themselves walking more softly, breathing more quietly, as if afraid to disturb some delicate equilibrium that the forest has established. This is when the philosophical weight of the experience begins to manifest. In the absence of the constant noise that usually occupies the channels of consciousness, the radio chatter, the phone conversations, the background television, the hum of appliances, the rumble of traffic, the traveler is suddenly confronted with the raw fact of their own existence in a way that is both startling and unsettling. Here, stripped of the familiar audio landscape that normally mediates between consciousness and world, the fundamental situation of being human reveals itself with unprecedented clarity. Martin Heidegger would have recognized this moment as an encounter with what he called Geworfenheit, thrownness or facticity. It is the visceral realization that we have been thrown into existence without our consent, deposited in a world we did not choose, in a body we did not design, with capacities and limitations we did not select. The silence of the forest strips away the usual distractions that allow us to avoid confronting this basic existential fact, leaving consciousness face to face with the brute reality of its own inexplicable presence. Standing in this cathedral of quiet, the traveler experiences what might be called the weight of being. Each breath becomes not just a biological function, but a small affirmation of continued existence, a choice to keep going that must be made moment by moment. The heartbeat transforms from an automatic process into something more like a drum marking time in a universe that offers no explanation for why there should be time at all, or consciousness to experience it. The forest silence reveals itself as profoundly different from human silence. When humans fall silent, it is usually temporary, a pause between words, a moment of consideration before speech resumes. But the forest quiet is not a pause. It is a way of being. The trees have been standing in this contemplative stillness for decades, perhaps centuries, rooted in a mode of existence that knows nothing of the human need to fill empty spaces with sound and movement. Their silence speaks of patience beyond human comprehension, of a relationship with time that is measured not in minutes or hours, but in seasons and decades. This encounter with a fundamentally different mode of being creates what existentialists would recognize as a profound experience of alienation. Not alienation from other humans, but from the comfortable assumption that human ways of existing are somehow natural or inevitable. The forest silence reveals human chattiness as just one possible way of being among many, and perhaps not the most profound one. In the presence of these ancient, wordless beings, human speech begins to seem almost frantic, a desperate attempt to fill a void that might be better left unfilled. As minutes pass, though the traveler has already lost track of clock time, the oppressive quality of the silence begins to shift. What initially felt overwhelming gradually transforms into something more like embrace. The quiet that seemed to press inward now feels more like a vast space opening outward, an infinite acoustic cathedral, in which the smallest sounds take on cathedral-like resonance. The traveler's footsteps, nearly inaudible on the soft forest floor, seem to echo into vast distances. A breath becomes a prayer, a heartbeat to him. This transformation reveals another dimension of facticity that philosophy alone cannot capture. To be thrown into the world is not just to be deposited in an alien environment, but to discover that this alienness is also, paradoxically, home. The strangeness of existence is not something to be overcome or explained away, but something to be inhabited. The forest silence teaches that it is possible to dwell in the mystery of being without needing to solve it, to be at home in homelessness, to find peace in the very restlessness that defines human consciousness. The traveler begins to notice how the silence creates its own rhythm, its own grammar of pauses and emphases. A bird call in the distance becomes not an interruption to quiet, but part of its syntax, a punctuation mark in the forest's ongoing meditation. The crack of a twig underfoot is not a violation of the peace, but a word in the conversation between walker and woodland, a moment of contact between two different modes of being. In this expanding awareness, the traveler begins to understand that the silence is not empty, but full, pregnant with possibilities that have not yet crystallized into definite forms. It is the silence in which all sounds emerge, into which they return, the background against which all foreground experiences play out. To inhabit this silence is to position oneself at the source of experience rather than in its products, to dwell in the space of pure possibility, rather than the realm of actualized facts. The philosophical implications deepen with each step forward. The silence reveals how much of what we normally take to be reality is actually constructed from the constant noise of culture, language, and social interaction. Stripped of this acoustic scaffolding, consciousness encounters itself more directly, less mediated by the interpretive frameworks that usually organize experience. The result is both liberation and anxiety. Liberation from the tyranny of constant stimulation, but anxiety at the responsibility this creates for constructing meaning from scratch. As the traveler moves deeper into the forest's acoustic embrace, the silence itself begins to speak in ways that transcend language. It speaks of time as something other than forward progress, of space as something other than distance to be covered, of self as something other than the stories we tell about ourselves. It offers no answers to the questions that brought the traveler to the forest's edge, but it does something perhaps more valuable. It changes the nature of the questions themselves, transforming urgent demands for explanation into patient willingness to dwell in mystery. The heart continues its steady rhythm. The breath flows in and out. The leaves whisper their ancient secrets, and the traveler walks on, no longer fighting the silence, but learning to inhabit it, discovering in its depths not emptiness, but the fertile void from which all authentic existence springs. Part 3. Paths that Fade. Having grown accustomed to the forest's profound silence, the traveler advances deeper into its embrace, expecting to find some kind of path, some indication of where to go next. The assumption seems reasonable. Surely others have walked here before. Surely the forest, like all wild places touched by human presence, would bear the subtle scars of previous passages. Worn earth, broken twigs, the faint impression left by countless footfalls over time. At first, this expectation appears to be fulfilled. Perhaps 50 yards beyond the Gate of Mist, what looks unmistakably like a trail materializes from the forest floor. It is nothing elaborate, merely a narrow ribbon of slightly compressed earth winding between the trees, perhaps 2 feet wide, carpeted with fewer fallen leaves than the surrounding woodland. The traveler feels a moment of relief, a restoration of familiar order. Here is something recognizable, a thread of human logic imposed upon the wilderness, a line to follow that promises direction and purpose. But as the traveler begins to follow this apparent path, something strange occurs. The trail, which had seemed so definite just moments before, begins to grow less certain with each step forward. What had appeared to be a clear line of travel becomes ambiguous, contested by the forest's own geometry. A fallen log blocks the way, forcing a detour to the left. But when the traveler attempts to rejoin the original line, the path seems to have shifted or perhaps vanished altogether. The slight depression in the earth that had marked the trail now appears to be nothing more than a natural drainage channel, carved by rainwater rather than human feet. The traveler pauses, looking back toward where the path had been so obvious just moments before. But even that certainty crumbles under closer examination. The route that had seemed so clear in retrospect now appears to be nothing more than a series of gaps between trees that the mind had connected into a false pattern. The way constellations are formed by imposing lines between unrelated stars. The very ground seems to shift under the scrutiny, leaves rustling in the slight breeze to cover and uncover patches of earth, creating the illusion of multiple potential paths, or perhaps no path at all. This phenomenon, the appearance and disappearance of trails, repeats itself throughout the next hour of walking. A promising route opens up to the right, marked by what appears to be a series of broken branches at shoulder height, as if someone had pushed through this way before. The traveler follows this new indication with growing confidence, only to find that the broken branches are the result of a fallen tree that had crashed through the canopy months, or perhaps years ago, creating a temporary corridor that leads nowhere in particular and certainly bears no relation to human passage. Another path reveals itself as a game trail, the narrow corridor worn by deer and other woodland creatures moving between feeding and watering areas. For a time, this seems like a reasonable solution to the problem of navigation. After all, animal paths often lead to clearings, to streams, to elevated ground from which one might gain perspective on a larger landscape. But following this track proves frustrating in its own way. Game trails are designed for quadrupedal creatures much smaller than humans, threading through brambles and under low-hanging branches in ways that require constant ducking and twisting. More fundamentally, they are organized around a logic of animal needs rather than human purposes, leading to destinations that make perfect sense to a deer but offer nothing meaningful to a traveler seeking something more profound than the next patch of edible vegetation. The mist, which had seemed to lift slightly after the first penetration into the forest, begins to thicken again as the day advances. What little illumination filters down to the canopy becomes increasingly diffuse and directionless. This atmospheric shift has a profound effect on the visibility of potential paths. Routes that seem clear in better light become dubious in the growing gloom. The forest floor, covered with its carpet of decomposing leaves, takes on a uniform appearance that makes any subtle indications of passage nearly impossible to detect. It is in this context of increasing uncertainty that the philosophical implications of the situation begin to manifest with full force. Jean-Paul Sartre would have recognized this moment as a perfect illustration of what he called the burden of freedom, the inescapable responsibility that consciousness bears for choosing its own path in a universe that offers no predetermined routes, no clear indications of which way to go, no external authority to consult for guidance. The traveler stands at what might be a fork in the trail, or might simply be a place where the space in between trees creates the illusion of multiple options. To the left, the forest floor rises slightly, suggesting higher ground that might offer better visibility. To the right, the sound of water, perhaps a stream, perhaps merely the drip of condensation from leaves, suggests a different kind of destination. Straight ahead, the path, if it is indeed a path, continues into the mist with no indication of where it might lead. Each option presents itself with equal validity and equal uncertainty. There are no signs, no markers, no evidence that one choice is objectively better than another. The traveler realizes with growing unease that any decision made in this moment will be based not on external criteria, but on internal factors: preference, intuition, arbitrary whim, or simple desperation to move forward rather than remain paralyzed by indecision. This is the moment when Sartre's famous declaration that humans are condemned to be free reveals its full existential weight. The traveler cannot appeal to social convention. There is no established etiquette for navigating unmarked forest paths. There is no expert to consult, no guidebook to reference, no GPS signal to follow. Even the strategy of simply turning around and going back to the entrance proves impossible, as the path behind is proven just as illusory as those ahead. The very attempt to retrace steps reveals that the route taken to reach this point was itself a construction of consciousness rather than an objective feature of the landscape. The weight of this realization settles over the traveler, like the thickening mist itself. Every step taken from this point forward will be a pure act of self-determination, unsupported by external validation. More troubling still is the recognition that even refusing to choose, standing still, waiting for clearer conditions, hoping for some sign to appear, is itself a choice, and one with its own irreversible consequences. Time continues to pass, daylight continues to fade, and the option of remaining in this particular spot indefinitely becomes increasingly untenable. Sartre understood that this burden of choice extends beyond practical decisions to encompass the entire structure of human existence. We are not simply choosing which path to take through a forest. We are choosing who to be, what to value, how to interpret the meaning of our actions and experiences. The forest's refusal to offer clear guidance becomes a metaphor for the universe's fundamental silence on questions of value and purpose. We must choose our own meaning, create our own significance, determine our own direction, not because these choices are objectively correct, but because the alternative is to remain frozen in the paralysis of infinite possibility. The traveler begins to understand that the paths appearing and disappearing in the mist are not simply a feature of this particular forest, but a fundamental characteristic of conscious existence itself. The routes we follow through life, career paths, relationship choices, moral commitments, spiritual beliefs, all possess the same ephemeral quality as these woodland trails. They seem solid and inevitable when we are following them, but they reveal their constructed nature the moment we attempt to examine them closely or recommend them to others. As this understanding deepens, the traveler notices that the anxiety produced by the situation begins to transform into something else. The burden of choice, initially overwhelming, gradually reveals itself as a foundation of authentic freedom. If there are no predetermined paths, then every step becomes an act of creation rather than mere following. The traveler is not simply navigating through a pre-existing landscape, but actively participating in the construction of the very terrain through which they move. This realization brings with it both terror and exhilaration. Terror at the recognition that there is no external authority to blame for wrong choices, no predetermined destiny to fulfill, no objective standard of success or failure to measure against. But also exhilaration at the discovery that consciousness possesses the power to create meaning through its choices, to impose direction on an otherwise directionless universe, to transform arbitrary decisions into purposeful action through the simple act of commitment. The mist continues to swirl around the trees, occasionally lifting to reveal what might be a promising route, then settling again to obscure it. The traveler realizes that this atmospheric condition is not an obstacle to be overcome, but the very medium within which authentic choice must occur. Clarity is not a prerequisite for decision. It is often the result of decision. The path becomes visible not before we choose it, but because we choose it, standing at this crossroads of possibility. The traveler experiences what Sartre would have called anguish, not the fear of any particular outcome, but the vertigo that comes from recognizing the absolute freedom to choose any outcome at all. It is a dizziness of standing at the edge of infinite possibility, knowing that whatever direction is chosen will foreclose all the others, will determine not just where the traveler goes, but who the traveler becomes in the going. The forest offers no comfort for this anxiety, no reassurance that any choice is better than any other. The trees stand in their ancient silence, witnesses to countless decisions made by countless travelers, but offering no judgment, no guidance, no indication of approval or disapproval. They have seen beings choose the left path and the right path, the high road and the low road, the direct route and the circuitous one. And they have learned that the significance of these choices lies not in their external consequences, but in the consciousness that makes them. As the light continues to fade and the mist continues to thicken, the traveler faces the irreducible fact of human freedom, the necessity of choosing without guarantee, of acting without certainty, of committing to a direction based on nothing more solid than a resolve to take responsibility for whatever follows. The moment of decision arrives not with fanfare, but with a quiet recognition that further deliberation will not produce greater clarity. The traveler chooses a leftward path, not because it promises better outcomes than the alternatives, not because some internal compass points definitively in that direction, but simply because the burden of choice demands resolution, and any authentic choice is preferable to paralysis of endless consideration. With the first step in the chosen direction, something remarkable occurs. The path that seemed so uncertain, so potentially illusory, begins to solidify under the traveler's feet. Not literally. The forest floor remains as soft and yielding as before, but experientially, by choosing this route, by committing to it through action rather than mere intention, the traveler transforms it from one possibility among many into the actual terrain of lived experience. The path becomes real because it is walked, meaningful because it is chosen, significant because consciousness has invested itself in its traversal. This is a paradox that Sartre understood better than perhaps any other philosopher. Freedom is not the ability to choose without consequences, but the inescapable responsibility to create consequences through choice. We are condemned to be free precisely because we cannot escape the burden of determining our own meaning, of constructing our own significance, of taking responsibility for the world we create through our decisions. As the traveler moves forward on the chosen path, the other possibilities, the rightward route, the straight-ahead option, the imagined path back to the entrance, begin to fade not just from sight, but from practical relevance. They become part of what existentialists call the not chosen, the vast realm of alternative possibilities that consciousness must sacrifice in order to actualize any particular possibility. This sacrifice is not a loss to be mourned, but the very mechanism by which meaning is created. Without the foreclosure of alternatives, no choice would have significance. Without the irreversibility of commitment, no action would have weight. The forest accepts this choice with the same neutral silence it had maintained during the traveler's period of deliberation. The trees do not applaud the decision or express disappointment at the paths not taken. They simply continue their ancient practice of standing witness to the choices made by conscious beings, offering neither validation nor condemnation, but something perhaps more valuable: the steady presence of a world that exists independently of human decision-making, but which becomes meaningful only through human engagement. The chosen path leads deeper into uncertainty, but it is now an uncertainty that consciousness has embraced rather than suffered passively. Each step forward is both a commitment to the unknown and an act of self-creation. The traveler is no longer simply moving through a pre-existing landscape, but actively participating in the construction of their own experience, their own identity, their own story. In the gathering darkness, with the mist swirling around the trees and the sound of the outside world now completely absorbed by the forest's acoustic embrace, the traveler walks on, not toward any predetermined destination, but into the open future that consciousness creates through the simple, revolutionary act of choosing to keep going. Part 4, the empty clearing. The path that had solidified under the traveler's commitment leads steadily deeper into the forest's heart, winding between increasingly ancient trees whose trunks grow so massive that their bark disappears into shadow long before reaching the invisible canopy above. The mist here moves differently than it had near the entrance, not swirling with the restless energy of weather, but hanging in the air with an almost liquid stillness, as if the forest has learned to breathe so slowly that even its exhalations have become suspended in time. After what feels like hours of walking, though time has lost its familiar markers in this place where shadows neither lengthen nor shorten with any observable rhythm, the traveler begins to notice a change in the quality of light ahead. It is not the golden warmth of sunlight breaking through leaves, nor the cool blue of filtered daylight, but something else entirely. A pale, sourceless illumination that seemed to emanate from the air itself rather than from any particular direction. As the path curves around a massive oak whose circumference would require a dozen people holding hands to encompass, the source of this strange light reveals itself. Beyond the tree's bulk lies a clearing, a perfect circle of open space perhaps 100 feet across, carved from the forest as if a giant hand had simply lifted away all the trees, roots and all, leaving behind an arena of grass and wildflowers under an open sky. The traveler emerges from the forest's embrace into the sudden vastness with a sense of relief that borders on euphoria after the claustrophobic intimacy of the woodland paths, where visibility rarely extended beyond a few dozen yards and the canopy pressed down like a green ceiling. This expansive opening feels like a kind of liberation. Here is space to breathe, to see, to orient oneself in relation to a horizon that extends beyond the immediate tangle of trunks and branches. But the euphoria fades quickly, replaced by something far more unsettling. The clearing is empty. Not empty in the way of a meadow waiting to be discovered, rich with the possibility of hidden life and subtle activity, but empty in a more profound and disturbing sense. It is empty the way a stage is empty after the curtain falls and the audience has gone home, not merely unoccupied, but somehow bereft, marked by the absence of something that should be present. The traveler stands at the clearing's edge for several minutes, reluctant to step fully into the open space, scanning the circle of grass for any sign of what might justify this dramatic interruption in the forest continuity. Surely such a perfect clearing, so precisely carved from the surrounding woodland, must serve some purpose. Surely it exists to contain something, a monument, a structure, a gathering place, a shrine, even ruins that would indicate some former significance. But there is nothing. The grass grows thick and even, unmarked by paths or the circular patterns that would indicate regular use. No stone breaks the surface to suggest ancient construction or natural outcropping. No ring of rocks indicates a fire pit or ceremonial space. No worn patches in the vegetation reveal where others might have sat or slept or performed whatever activities such a space might naturally invite. The clearing simply exists, complete and purposeless, like a sentence with all the words removed except the punctuation. Taking the first tentative steps into the open space, the traveler experiences a strange sensation, as if crossing an invisible threshold into a different kind of reality altogether. The grass underfoot feels real enough, soft and slightly damp with dew that has not yet burned off in the weak light that filters down from the overcast sky above. But the space itself seems to resist habitation in ways that are difficult to articulate. It is not unwelcoming in any active sense, not hostile or forbidding, but rather profoundly indifferent to human presence, as if it exists in a realm where concepts like welcome and hostility simply have no application. Moving toward the clearing center, the traveler becomes increasingly aware of the silence that fills this space. It is not the rich, textured silence of the forest, where the absence of human noise was filled with the subtle sounds of wind and leaves, breathing trees and settling earth. This is silence of a different order entirely. Not the absence of particular sounds, but the absence of the possibility of sound itself. Even the traveler's own footsteps seem muffled to the point of near inaudibility, as if the clearing absorbed all vibrations before they could properly form into recognizable noise. At the center of the strange amphitheater, the traveler stops and slowly turns in a complete circle, taking in the perfect symmetry of the space. The forest wall rises on all sides like the ramparts of some vast natural fortress, creating a sense of enclosure despite the open sky above. But this enclosure feels less like protection than like containment. as if the clearing exists not as a refuge in the forest, but as a space that the forest has deliberately excluded from its domain. The philosophical implications of this emptiness begin to manifest not as thoughts but as feelings, a growing unease that starts in the pit of the stomach and radiates outward to the nervous system like a slow poison. This is what Martin Heidegger and Jean-Paul Sartre would have recognized as an encounter with Das Nichts, the nothing, not merely the absence of particular things, but the presence of absence itself as a fundamental feature of existence. Standing in this void, the traveler begins to understand that they have been carrying certain expectations into the forest, certain assumptions about what such a journey might yield. There had been an implicit faith that following the path, making the difficult choices, pushing deeper into the unknown would eventually lead to some kind of revelation, some discovery that would justify the effort and anxiety of the journey. The clearing had seemed to promise exactly such a payoff, a destination where meaning might finally declare itself, where the questions that had drawn consciousness into this wilderness might find their answers. But the clearing offers no such satisfaction. It presents itself as pure space, empty of significance beyond its own inexplicable existence. There are no symbols to interpret, no signs to decode, no hidden messages waiting to be discovered by the sufficiently attentive observer. The emptiness is not a puzzle to be solved, but a fact to be confronted. The irreducible reality that existence itself might be fundamentally without predetermined purpose or inherent meaning. This realization brings with a profound sense of vertigo, not physical but existential. The traveler experiences what Sartre called nausea, not disgust at any particular object or situation, but a deeper sickness that comes from recognizing the contingency of existence itself. Everything that is could just as easily not be. Everything that seems solid and necessary reveals itself as arbitrary and temporary. The clearing embodies this contingency in its perfect, purposeless presence, existing not because it serves any function, but simply because it happens to exist. The grass beneath the traveler's feet could be concrete or sand or bare earth. The clearing would remain equally empty of intrinsic significance. The circular shape could be square or triangular or completely irregular. Its meaning, or lack thereof, would remain unchanged. The very atoms that compose this space could be arranged differently or not exist at all, and the universe would continue its expansion into infinity with perfect indifference to the alteration. Yet, paradoxically, this encounter with nothingness becomes a form of revelation in its own right. The emptiness of the clearing forces consciousness to confront its own tendency to project meaning onto external situations, to expect the world to provide ready-made significance rather than accepting the responsibility for creating significance through its own choices and commitments. The absence of answers becomes an answer of sorts, not to the specific questions that brought the traveler here, but to the more fundamental question of where answers come from in the first place. As this understanding deepens, the traveler begins to notice subtle changes in their relationship to the empty space. What had initially felt like a betrayal, the promise of significance that led only to void, gradually transforms into something approaching peace. The clearing's refusal to provide external validation for the journey becomes a kind of gift, forcing consciousness back upon its own resources, compelling it to take responsibility for whatever meaning the experience might ultimately possess. The silence that had seemed so oppressive begins to feel more like spaciousness, creating room for thoughts and feelings that would normally be crowded out by the noise of expectation and desire. Without the distraction of trying to decode hidden messages or discover concealed purposes, consciousness finds itself free to simply be present to its own existence, to experience the strange miracle of awareness itself without needing to justify or explain or elaborate upon it. The traveler sits down in the center of the clearing, feeling the cool grass against palms and the solid earth beneath. From this lower perspective, the forest wall seems even higher and more enclosing, but also more distant, as if the clearing has expanded in response to acceptance rather than resistance. The overcast sky above reveals itself to be not empty, but filled with subtle gradations of gray and white, clouds moving so slowly that their motion is barely perceptible, like thoughts forming and dissolving at the edge of consciousness. Time passes, minutes or hours, it no longer matters. The emptiness of the clearing gradually reveals itself to be not an absence, but a presence of a different order, not the lack of something, but the space within which something might emerge. It is not empty like a vacuum, but empty like a canvas before the first brushstroke, empty like silence before the first note, empty like consciousness before the first thought. This is a nothingness that existentialists understood to be not the opposite of being, but its necessary complement, the void that gives shape to substance, the silence that gives meaning to sound, the absence that makes presence precious. Without this emptiness, existence would have no space within which to unfold. Without this silence, consciousness would have no medium through which to hear itself think. The traveler realizes that the journey into the forest has been, from the beginning, a journey into this emptiness. Not the emptiness of particular clearings in particular forests, but the fundamental emptiness that lies at the heart of conscious existence itself. We are beings who exist in the gap between what is and what might be, between the given world and the possible world, between the facts of our situation and the freedom to choose our response to those facts. Rising from the grass as daylight begins its slow fade toward evening, the traveler prepares to leave the clearing with a new understanding. The emptiness encountered here will travel with them, not as a burden but as a resource. The space of freedom within which authentic choice becomes possible, the silence within which the voice of genuine selfhood can finally be heard. The clearing remains empty as the traveler departs, but it is no longer empty in the same way. It has become a space that consciousness has inhabited, however briefly, and that inhabitation has transformed both the space and the consciousness that occupied it. The void that seemed to promise nothing has delivered everything necessary. The recognition that meaning is not discovered but created, not found but made, not given but chosen. As the forest path beckons on the clearing's far edge, the traveler steps back into the green shadows carrying this paradoxical gift. The fullness of emptiness, the presence of absence, the sound of silence that speaks more clearly than any words could ever manage. Part 5, Shadows of the Self. Leaving the empty clearing behind, the traveler re-enters a forest with subtle but significant shift in perception. The void encountered at the heart of that perfect circle has not disappeared but has been internalized, carried forward as a new kind of awareness, an understanding that emptiness and fullness are not opposites but complementary aspects of the same existential reality. The path beyond the clearing winds upward along a gentle slope, and as the traveler climbs, the character light filtering through the canopy begins to change. Where the deeper forests have been shrouded in a uniform twilight, broken only by the occasional shaft of pale illumination, this elevated terrain emits a different quality of luminescence. The sun, invisible but undeniably present somewhere above the leafy ceiling, sends down more defined rays that slice through gaps in the foliage with the precision of searchlights. These beams create dramatic chiaroscuro effects across the forest floor, painting the landscape in stark contrast of brilliant illumination and profound shadow. It is in this theater of light and darkness that the traveler first becomes consciously aware of their own shadow, not as a mere optical phenomenon, but as something strange and revelatory. At first, the shadow appears normal enough, a dark silhouette cast upon the carpet of fallen leaves, a familiar companion that has accompanied every step since childhood but which rarely merits conscious attention. But as the traveler moves through this increasingly dramatic landscape of dappled light, the shadow begins to behave in ways that challenge its presumed familiarity. The shadow stretches and contracts with each change in the sun's angle as filtered to the moving leaves above. When the traveler passes beneath a thick cluster of branches, the shadow fragments into multiple pieces, parts of the silhouette scattered across different patches of illuminated ground, like a dismembered reflection. In other moments, when the path leads through a brief opening where more direct light penetrates, the shadow sharpens to an almost knife-edge definition before dissolving again into ambiguity as the canopy reasserts its dominance. But it is not just a changing intensity and fragmentation of the shadow that captures the traveler's attention. It is the way the shadow seems to shift in shape and character with each movement, each change in posture, each alteration in direction. A simple step to the left transforms what had appeared to be the shadow of an upright, confident figure into something that looks hunched and uncertain. A slight adjustment in the angle of the head changes the shadow from that of someone gazing steadily forward to one that appears to be looking fearfully over their shoulder. As awareness of these transformations deepens, the traveler begins to move more deliberately, experimenting with the relationship between body and shadow. Raising an arm creates a shadow that could belong to someone waving in greeting or someone reaching desperately for help. Tilting the head back to look up at the canopy produces a silhouette that might suggest wonder and contemplation, or might equally indicate arrogance and defiance. The same physical gesture, cast as shadow, becomes ambiguous, open to multiple interpretations depending on the observer's perspective and the narrative they choose to impose upon the dark shape. This multiplicity of possible meanings within a single shadow begins to feel like a revelation about the nature of identity itself. The traveler realizes that what we call the self might be no more fixed or definitive than these shifting shadows. Not a solid, unchanging essence that casts consistent reflections across all circumstances, but something fluid and contextual, constantly reshaped by the interplay between the light of consciousness and the various surfaces upon which that consciousness projects itself. Jean-Paul Sartre would have recognized this moment as a direct encounter with one of existentialism's most radical insights, that existence precedes essence, that we exist first and only afterward construct a meaning of that existence through our choices and actions. The shadow becomes a perfect metaphor for this process of self-creation, demonstrating how the same underlying reality, the physical body moving through space, can cast entirely different impressions depending on the angle of illumination, the nature of the surface on which it falls, and the interpretive framework through which it is viewed. The traveler continues up the slope, now paying close attention to the shadow's behavior across different terrains. On smooth patches of earth, the shadow appears sharp and well-defined, creating the illusion of clarity about the self it represents. But when the path crosses areas covered with fallen branches and uneven ground, the shadow breaks apart, distorts, and recombines in ways that make its relationship to the body, casting it seem increasingly tenuous and arbitrary. At one point, the path leads through a grove of young birch trees whose white bark reflects light in unexpected ways, creating a complex interplay of shadows and reflections that multiplies the traveler's silhouette into dozens of variations. Some shadows are sharp and dark, others pale and diffuse. Some capture the full outline of the human form, while others fragment into abstract shapes that bear only the loosest relationship to their source. In this bewildering gallery of self-reflections, the question of which shadow represents a real traveler becomes meaningless. They are all equally real and equally constructed, all valid projections of the same underlying existence, encountering different conditions of illumination. This multiplicity extends beyond mere visual effects to touch something deeper about the nature of identity. The traveler begins to recognize that in daily life, we cast different shadows in different social contexts, presenting one version of ourselves to family, another to colleagues, another to strangers on the street. Each context provides its own particular lighting that emphasizes certain aspects of personality while leaving others in shadow. The confident professional self might cast a very different shadow than the uncertain child self that emerges in the presence of aging parents. The compassionate friend self creates a different silhouette than the competitive rival self that appears in certain social situations. But which of these shadows represents the true self? The forest light show suggests that this question is based on a false premise, that there is some essential, unchanging core identity that these various presentations either reveal or conceal. Instead, the shifting shadows suggest that identity is more like performance than a discovery, more like improvisation and recitation of a predetermined script. As the traveler moves through an area where the canopy opens and closes rhythmically in response to a light breeze, the shadow appears and disappears, sharpens and blurs in a hypnotic cycle. This rhythm creates a kind of meditation on presence and absence, being and non-being. When the shadow is sharp and clear, there is a strong sense of definite identity, of being someone particular with specific characteristics and boundaries. But when the shadow dissolves in diffuse light or fragments across uneven ground, that sense of definite selfhood dissolves with it, replaced by something more fluid and open-ended. The psychological impact of this extended observation becomes increasingly profound. The traveler begins to feel a loosening of attachment to fixed self-concepts, a growing comfort with uncertainty about their own fundamental nature. If the shadow can change so dramatically while the body casting it remains essentially the same, perhaps the various aspects of personality and identity that feel so solid and permanent are equally provisional and contextual. This insight brings both liberation and anxiety. Liberation from the burden of maintaining a consistent, unchanging self-image across all situations and relationships. If identity is constructed rather than discovered, then it can be reconstructed, redesigned, reimagined in response to new circumstances and new choices. The shadow that appears hunched and defeated in one moment can transform into one that stands tall and confident simply by changing posture, changing direction, changing the angle of engagement with the available light. But this freedom comes with its own form of anxiety, the vertigo that accompanies a recognition that there may be no solid ground of essential selfhood to fall back upon when constructed identities prove inadequate or unsustainable. If we are not discovering ourselves but creating ourselves, then we bear full responsibility for who we become, with no essence or nature to blame for our failures or credit for our successes. The path begins to level out as it approaches what appears to be a ridge or elevated plateau. Here, the light filtering to the canopy becomes more consistent and directional, suggesting either a clearing ahead or a significant thinning of the forest cover. In this more stable illumination, the traveler's shadow achieves a kind of equilibrium, still responsive to movement and gesture, but less subject to the dramatic fragmentations and distortions of the previous terrain. Standing at what seems to be the crest of the ridge, the traveler pauses to take a final, deliberate look at their shadow. In this moment of stillness, the dark silhouette appears almost ordinary again, just a person standing on a forest path, nothing more or less than what it appears to be. But the traveler now carries the knowledge that this apparent simplicity is deceptive, that beneath the surface of any seemingly stable identity lies an infinite capacity for transformation and reinvention. The shadow, the traveler realizes, is not a copy of the self, but a creation of the self, one of countless possible projections that consciousness can cast onto the world through the choices it makes about how to stand, how to move, how to orient itself in relation to whatever light is available. This understanding transforms the shadow from a mere side effect of embodied existence into a powerful symbol of human freedom and responsibility. As the light continues to shift through the afternoon hours, creating new patterns of illumination and shadow across the forest floor, the traveler prepares to continue the journey with a new appreciation for constructed nature of identity. Each step forward will not simply reveal who they are, but will participate in the ongoing creation of who they are becoming. The path ahead remains uncertain, but the shadow it will create is entirely within the traveler's power to shape. Moving forward from this elevated perspective, carrying the memory of shadows that danced and shifted with each movement, the traveler embraces the existential truth that Sartre articulated so clearly. We are condemned to be free, not just to choose our actions, but to choose ourselves, to construct our own essence through the accumulation of our choices, to cast our own shadows upon whatever surfaces the journey provides. Part 6. The Stone in the Path. The path descends from the ridge through a section of forest where the trees grow closer together, their trunks forming natural corridors that channel movement in specific directions. The canopy here is thickened again, reducing the dramatic play of light and shadow that had characterized the previous terrain, returning the traveler to the more subdued illumination of the forest's deeper regions. The ground underfoot becomes increasingly rocky, with exposed roots and scattered stones creating an uneven surface that demands more careful attention to each footfall. It is in this context of narrowing options and increasing difficulty that the traveler encounters the obstacle that would define this section of the journey, a massive boulder that completely blocks the path ahead. The stone is enormous, perhaps 12 feet high and nearly as wide, its gray granite surface weathered smooth by countless seasons of rain and wind. It sits squarely across what had been a clear route forward, as immovable and indifferent as a mountain peak, transforming what had been a manageable walk into a significant challenge. The traveler's first reaction is simple frustration. After the philosophical complexities of the empty clearing and the revelatory experience with shifting shadows, this obstacle feels almost insulting in its crude materiality. Here is no subtle metaphor for the human condition, no elegant symbol of existential truth, but simply a large rock blocking the way, the kind of mundane impediment that hiking guides warn about and trail maintenance crews exist to remove. The immediate impulse is to look for some way around it, some obvious solution that would allow the journey to continue without significant disruption. But exploration of the boulder's perimeter quickly reveals the futility of this hope. To the left, the stone extends into a dense thicket of thorny undergrowth that will require hours of painful bushwhacking to penetrate, with no guarantee of finding a way through. To the right, the ground drops away in a steep slope that would be dangerous to attempt, especially given the loose soil and exposed rocks that characterize the descent. The forest has conspired to make this boulder not merely an obstacle, but a definitive barrier, a place where the easy forward momentum of the journey must come to a complete halt. Standing before this immovable challenge, the traveler experiences what the existentialist philosopher Karl Jaspers would have called a limit situation, one of those unavoidable circumstances that force consciousness to confront the fundamental realities of existence without the usual buffers of routine, choice, or gradual accommodation. Limit situations cannot be postponed, avoided, or delegated to others. They demand immediate response and reveal character in ways that ordinary circumstances rarely do. The boulder presents three basic options, each carrying its own implications and requirements. The first is to attempt to scale the obstacle directly, to find handholds and footholds on its weathered surface and climb over it through physical effort and determination. The second is to retreat, to acknowledge that this particular path has reached its limit and return to some previous point where alternative routes might be available. The third is to abandon the established path entirely and strike out in a new direction through unmarked forest, accepting the risks and uncertainties that such a choice would entail. Each option represents more than a practical decision about how to deal with a block trail. They constitute different approaches to the fundamental challenges that existence presents to conscious beings, different philosophies of how to respond when life places seemingly insurmountable obstacles in our path. The choice to climb represents a heroic response, the decision to meet obstacles head-on through will, effort, and determination. Looking up at the boulder's imposing height, the traveler can see that such an approach will be physically demanding and potentially dangerous. The granite surface, while weathered, offers only marginal handholds, and the height is sufficient that a fall could result in serious injury. But the climb is not impossible. With careful attention to balance and route finding, with willingness to accept risk and endure discomfort, the obstacle could be overcome through direct confrontation. This heroic option appeals to something deep in human psychology, the desire to prove ourselves against challenges, to demonstrate that obstacles exist to be conquered rather than avoided. There is dignity in the choice to climb, a kind of nobility in the refusal to be turned back by mere material resistance. The boulder becomes a test of character, an opportunity to discover or demonstrate reserves of strength and determination that might otherwise remain untapped. But the heroic response also carries its own forms of blindness and limitation. The focus on overcoming the obstacle can become an end in itself, divorced from any larger consideration of whether such effort serves meaningful purposes. The climber might succeed in scaling the boulder only to discover that the path beyond leads nowhere worth going, or that the energy expended in the climb leaves insufficient resources for the challenges that follow. The heroic impulse can transform rational problem-solving into mere stubbornness, turning obstacles into obsessions that distort judgment and consume disproportionate amount of attention and effort. The second option, retreat, initially appears less appealing to pride but may represent superior wisdom. To turn back is to acknowledge that some obstacles are not meant to be overcome directly, that prudence sometimes counsels withdrawal and reconsideration rather than aggressive confrontation. Part 7, The Distant Song. Having made the difficult decision at the boulder, whether through heroic climbing, prudent retreat, or innovative path-breaking, the traveler continues deeper into the forest's heart, carrying the weight of that choice like a stone in the pocket, a constant reminder of the moment when we'll crystallize into action. The terrain beyond the obstacle has proven different from what came before. Wilder, less marked by any suggestion of previous human passage, more thoroughly claimed by the ancient rhythms of growth and decay that govern the woodland's deeper mysteries. The canopy here grows so thick that individual shafts of sunlight become rare events, celebrated by patches of ferns and wildflowers that have positioned themselves to catch these precious moments of direct illumination. The air itself feels different, heavier, more saturated with the moisture released by countless breathing trees, thick with the complex perfumes of moss and decomposing leaves, alive with the almost inaudible whisper of photosynthesis and transpiration occurring on a massive scale. It is in this cathedral of green twilight that the traveler first hears the sound that would define this portion of the journey. Initially, it seems to be nothing more than wind moving through the upper branches, a soft, sustained note that rises and falls with the irregular rhythm of air currents navigating the complex architecture of leaves and twigs. But as the traveler pauses to listen more carefully, something about the sound begins to seem unusual, anomalous, deserving of closer attention. The note does not behave quite like wind should behave. Wind typically creates sound that varies in direct relationship to its intensity. Stronger gusts produce louder noise. Gentler breezes create softer whispers. But this sound maintains a curious consistency of tone and volume that seems independent of any visible movement in the surrounding foliage. The leaves hang still while the sound continues or rustle vigorously, while the note maintains its steady presence, as if the two phenomena exist in parallel rather than cause a relationship. More intriguingly, there is something almost musical about the sound, a quality that suggests intentionality rather than mere atmospheric accident. It is not quite a song, too wordless and abstract for that designation, but neither is it entirely random noise. It occupies some middle ground between natural phenomenon and artistic expression, between the unconscious voice of the wind and the deliberate communication of a conscious being. As minutes pass and the sound continues, the traveler begins to hear, or perhaps to imagine hearing, variations in its pattern that seem almost linguistic. What had initially seemed like a single sustained note resolves into something more complex, rising and falling inflections that might be phrases, pauses that might be breaths, modulations that might be emotional expressions. The longer the traveler listens, the more the sound seems to be trying to communicate something specific, something urgent, something that demands response rather than mere passive reception. But trying to locate the source of this mysterious vocalization proves frustratingly difficult. The forest's acoustic properties create a kind of natural amphitheater where sounds can travel great distances, while being reflected, distorted, and redirected by the complex surfaces of bark and leaf. The voice, if it is indeed a voice, seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, sometimes appearing to emanate from directly ahead, sometimes from the left or right, sometimes from above or even behind. The traveler begins to move more slowly, pausing frequently to listen, trying to determine whether movement in any particular direction brings the sound closer or causes it to recede. But the results of these experiments remain ambiguous. Sometimes approaching a particular tree or thicket seems to intensify the voice, but just as often the sound fades as the traveler draws nearer, as if the source were retreating at exactly the same pace as a pursuit. This elusiveness transforms what might have been a simple matter of following an interesting sound into something more complex and philosophically charged. The voice becomes not just an acoustic phenomenon, but a puzzle about the nature of interpretation itself. A question about how consciousness constructs meaning from ambiguous sensory data, about how we decide what counts as a signal worth following and what can be dismissed as mere noise. The possibility that the sound represents another human being lost in the forest creates one interpretive framework. Perhaps it is someone calling for help, using whatever vocal resources they can muster to attract attention and assistance. The ethical implications of this interpretation are clear. If another person is in distress, the moral obligation is to attempt rescue, regardless of the personal cost or inconvenience such an effort might entail. The traveler's own journey becomes secondary to the more immediate responsibility of responding to human need. But this interpretation requires accepting several assumptions that cannot be verified. First, that the sound is indeed produced by human vocal cords rather than by some other source. Second, that if it is human, it represents a call for help rather than some other form of expression. Third, that responding to the call would actually be helpful rather than potentially dangerous for both parties. None of these assumptions can be confirmed without additional evidence. Yet the ethical weight of the first interpretation makes it difficult to dismiss entirely. An alternative framework suggests that the sound might be produced by some form of wildlife, perhaps a bird with unusually complex vocalizations, or a mammal whose species is unfamiliar to the traveler's urban-trained ears. Many forest creatures are capable of producing sounds that can seem startlingly human to untrained listeners, especially when filtered through the acoustic complexities of dense woodland. The haunting calls of loons, the territorial songs of certain songbirds, even the rutting calls of deer, can create vocalizations that might be mistaken for human communication under the right circumstances. This interpretation carries its own implications for action. If the sound represents natural wildlife behavior, then pursuing it might be intrusive or even dangerous. Many forest animals produce their most intense vocalizations during mating season or when defending territory, situations where human interference could provoke aggressive responses. Following the sound might lead not to a meaningful encounter, but to an unwelcome disruption of natural processes that function better without human observation or intervention. A third interpretive possibility is that the sound represents neither human distress nor animal behavior, but something else entirely. Perhaps the forest itself finding voice through some combination of wind patterns, tree resonance, and acoustic phenomena that science has not yet fully cataloged. The woods are full of sounds that seem to transcend their mechanical origins, creating what indigenous cultures have long recognized as the voice of the land itself, the expression of a consciousness that operates according to principles very different from human awareness. This interpretation opens up the most complex questions of all. If the forest itself is somehow speaking, what might it be trying to communicate? How should one respond to a voice that emerges from an entire ecosystem rather than from an individual organism? What would it mean to follow such a sound, and where might such following lead? As the traveler grapples with these competing interpretations, the sound itself continues to evolve. Sometimes it seems to grow more urgent, more insistent, as if aware that it has attracted attention, and is now attempting to communicate more directly. At other moments, it becomes almost conversational, rising and falling in patterns that seem to invite response, to create space for dialogue between the voice and its listener. The traveler experiments with making sounds in return, humming, whistling, even calling out brief verbal responses. Sometimes these efforts seem to provoke changes in the mysterious voice, variations in tone or rhythm that might indicate acknowledgement or interaction. But whether these apparent responses represent genuine communication or merely coincidental variation remains impossible to determine. The ambiguity becomes a meditation on the nature of meaning-making itself. In daily life, we constantly interpret ambiguous signals. Facial expressions that might indicate approval or disapproval, comments that might be sincere or sarcastic, silences that might be comfortable or hostile. The forest voice amplifies this ordinary challenge to an almost unbearable degree, creating a situation where the stakes of interpretation feel enormous, but the available evidence remains stubbornly inconclusive. Martin Heidegger would have recognized this situation as an encounter with what he called thrownness, our fundamental situation of being cast into a world where we must interpret and respond to circumstances without ever having access to complete or certain information. We are always already in the middle of situations that demand interpretation, always forced to act on partial knowledge, always responsible for the consequences of our understanding, even when that understanding might be flawed or incomplete. Jean-Paul Sartre would have seen in this moment a perfect illustration of the radical freedom and responsibility that defines human consciousness. The traveler must choose how to interpret the voice and how to respond to that interpretation, knowing that both the interpretation and the response are acts of self-creation rather than discoveries of pre-existing truth. There is no correct way to understand the forest voice, because correctness is not a category that applies to existential choices. There are only authentic and inauthentic responses to the irreducible ambiguity of existence. As afternoon light begins its slow fade toward evening, casting longer shadows to the forest understory, the voice continues its mysterious song. The traveler faces the same kind of fundamental choice that has characterized each stage of this journey, whether to follow the uncertain signal into unknown territory or to maintain the current course despite its own uncertainties and challenges. The decision cannot be made on purely rational grounds because the available information supports multiple contradictory conclusions. It must emerge instead from some deeper source, from the traveler's intuition about what kinds of risks are worth taking, what forms of meaning are worth pursuing, what it means to live authentically in a world where ambiguity is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be inhabited. The forest voice continues to call, patient and persistent, neither demanding response nor accepting dismissal, simply offering itself as possibility, as invitation, as a kind of uncertain signal that consciousness must learn to navigate if it hopes to find its way through the fundamental ambiguity that surrounds all authentic existence. The choice approaches, inevitable and irreversible, another step in the ongoing process of self-creation that defines the human journey through the wilderness of being. Part 8, The Water Mirror. The decision regarding the mysterious voice, whether to follow its elusive call or maintain the original course, has led the traveler through terrain that grows increasingly wild and untamed. The forest here feels ancient in ways that transcend mere chronological age, as if this particular grove has been quietly perfecting the art being woodland for so many centuries that it has achieved a kind of mastery over the essential rhythms of growth, decay, and renewal. The trees are massive, their trunks disappearing into a canopy so thick that the sky exists more as rumor than visible reality. The path, such as it ever was, has completely disappeared now, leaving the traveler to navigate by instinct and the subtle cues that experienced wilderness travelers learn to read. The way moss grows more thickly on the north side of stones, the gradual shift in elevation that suggests water sources, the quality of light that indicates openings ahead. Movement have become more deliberate, more conscious, each step requiring attention to ground conditions and obstacles that could easily turn an ankle or block passage entirely. It is in this context of heightened awareness and careful navigation that the traveler first catches a glimpse of reflected light through the trees ahead. Not the golden warmth of sunlight striking leaves, but the cooler, more neutral brilliance of sky reflected off water. The sight creates an almost magnetic pull, promising respite from the claustrophobic intimacy of the deep forest, offering the possibility of open space and clear visibility after hours of threading between closely spaced trunks. As the traveler approaches, pushing through a final screen of elderberry bushes and young maples, the water source reveals itself as a lake of perfect stillness. It is not large, perhaps 200 feet across at its widest point, but it possesses a quality of completeness that makes its modest size seem irrelevant. The lake sits in a natural depression surrounded by gently sloping banks, its surface so perfectly calm that it creates an almost perfect mirror, doubling the visible world by reflecting everything above with startling clarity and precision. The first impression is of stepping into a place where the ordinary laws of space and orientation have been suspended. Sky exists both above and below. Trees grow both up from the shore and down from the water's surface. Clouds drift simultaneously through air and liquid space. The effect is disorienting and magical, creating a sense of existing in two worlds at once, or perhaps in a single world that is folded in upon itself to create impossible geometries. The traveler approaches the water's edge with something approaching reverence, drawn by the extraordinary clarity of the reflection, but also aware that such perfect stillness suggests water that has remained undisturbed for a significant period. The lake's surface shows no ripples, no wake from waterfowl or fish, no disturbance from wind. Just the absolute mirror calm that creates this remarkable doubling of reality. Even the traveler's own approach seems to generate no air current sufficient to disturb the surface tension that maintains this aquatic perfection. Standing at the shoreline, the traveler looks down and experiences a moment of profound dislocation. There, staring back on the water, is a face that is simultaneously completely familiar and utterly strange. It is undeniably the traveler's own face, the same features that have looked back from bathroom mirrors and store windows for years. But something about seeing it reflected in this wild, natural mirror creates a sense of encountering it for the first time. Perhaps it is the context that makes the difference. This face has never been seen reflected in lake water before, never observed surrounded by the inverted images of ancient trees and drifting clouds. The usual associations that normally accompany self-recognition, memories of getting ready for work, checking appearance before social events, the casual glances that punctuate daily routine, are completely absent, leaving consciousness to encounter its own physical manifestation without the buffer of familiar circumstance. Or perhaps it is a quality of attention that transforms this ordinary act of self-recognition into something more profound. In daily life, we typically look at our reflections with specific purposes, checking for flaws to correct, confirming that we appear presentable, making adjustments to hair or clothing. These functional purposes create a kind of filter that prevents us from really seeing the face that looks back at us. But here, with no social expectations to meet and no practical adjustments to make, the traveler finds themselves truly looking, not at a reflection to be evaluated, but at a consciousness observing itself through the medium of reflected light. The philosophical implications of this encounter begin to unfold slowly, like ripples spreading across still water. Jean-Paul Sartre would have recognized this moment as a perfect illustration of what he called being for itself, encountering its own existence. Consciousness becoming aware of itself not just as a thinking process, but as a visible, physical presence in the world. The reflection in the water creates a unique form of self-objectification, allowing consciousness to see itself as others see it while simultaneously experiencing itself as the subject doing the seeing. This double awareness, being both the one who looks and the one who is looked at, creates a kind of existential vertigo. The face in the water is undeniably real, as solid and definite as any object in the external world. But it is also undeniably an image, a representation, a phenomenon that exists only because of precise arrangement of light, water, and observing consciousness. The traveler experiences the strange paradox of being confronted with objective evidence of their own subjective existence. The longer the traveler stares into the water, the more complex this self-encounter becomes. The face reflected there begins to seem less like a simple mirror image and more like a presence in its own right, a being with its own perspective and perhaps its own agenda. There is something uncanny about the way the reflection's eyes seem to be looking back, creating the illusion of a conversation between the self and itself, a dialogue conducted entirely through the medium of mutual gaze. This sense of otherness within sameness touches on what existentialists recognize as a fundamental alienation that consciousness experiences in relation to its own being. We are not simply identical with ourselves in any straightforward sense. Consciousness is always somewhat displaced from its own existence, always observing itself from a slight remove, always experiencing the gap between the I that thinks and the me that exists as an object in the world. The reflection in the lake makes this ordinarily invisible gap suddenly visible and immediate. The surrounding environment contributes its own layer of meaning to this encounter with selfhood. The inverted forest that frames a reflected face creates a context of wild beauty that contrasts sharply with the sterile backgrounds against which we typically encounter our own reflections. Here, the face appears as part of a larger natural composition, surrounded by the inverted images of sky and trees, integrated into a landscape that seems to suggest possibilities for selfhood that extend far beyond the social roles and conventional identities that normally define personal existence. The stillness of the water becomes itself a form of teaching. The perfect reflection is possible only because of the lake's complete calm, its freedom from the disturbances that would fragment or distort the image. This suggests something profound about the conditions necessary for authentic self-knowledge. Perhaps we can truly see ourselves only in moments of stillness, when the usual turbulence of daily life settles sufficiently to allow clear reflection to occur. But this stillness is also temporary and fragile. The traveler becomes acutely aware that the slightest movement, a step closer to the water's edge, a shift in posture, even a deep breath that might create air currents, could shatter this perfect reflection, sending ripples across the surface that would fragment the unified image into countless dancing pieces. The encounter with selfhood in its wholeness exists in a delicate balance that could be destroyed by any careless action. As this awareness deepens, the traveler begins to move with extraordinary care, conscious that this moment of clear self-reflection is precious precisely because of its fragility. Each breath is measured, each small shift in weight calculated to minimize disturbance to surrounding air. This heightened consciousness of one's own physical presence creates another layer of self-awareness, not just a visual confrontation with one's reflected image, but a kinesthetic awareness of existing as an embodied being whose slightest movements have consequences in the physical world. The light reflected off the water creates subtle variations in the quality of illumination falling on the traveler's actual face, creating a feedback loop between the reflection and the original. The face that looks down at the water is itself being lit by light bouncing up from the water surface, creating a soft, diffuse illumination unlike anything artificial lighting can achieve. This natural lighting reveals aspects of facial structure and expression that remain invisible under ordinary circumstances, adding to the sense of encountering oneself as if for the first time. Minutes pass in this profound stillness, consciousness absorbed in its own contemplation through the medium of reflected light. The experience becomes a kind of meditation, a wordless dialogue between the self and its own image that reveals layers of meaning normally hidden beneath the surface of daily awareness. The traveler begins to understand that this is not simply seeing oneself, but recognizing oneself, acknowledging the strange miracle of being a conscious being capable of observing its own existence. The reflected face begins to seem less like a simple image and more like a portal, a window into the mystery of consciousness itself. What is it that looks out through those reflected eyes? What is the nature of the awareness that can recognize itself in reflected light? These questions have puzzled philosophers for millennia, but here they arise not as abstract intellectual puzzles, but as immediate, visceral experiences of the mystery of selfhood. Gradually, The traveler becomes aware that this perfect moment of reflection cannot last indefinitely. The light is changing as the day advances, the quality of illumination shifting in ways that will eventually alter the clarity of the reflection. Even now, subtle movements in the upper atmosphere are creating almost imperceptible changes in the way clouds are reflected on the water surface. The perfect stillness that makes this encounter possible exists within a larger context of constant change and movement. This awareness of impermanence adds poignancy to the moment of self-recognition. The face in the water will never look exactly the same again, not just because of the inevitable changes that time brings to physical features, but because the precise conditions that create this particular quality of reflection exist only in this specific moment under these specific circumstances. The self that consciousness encounters in this wild mirror is both eternal and ephemeral, both the same self that has existed throughout the traveler's life, and a self that will never again be seen in quite this way. As the traveler prepares to continue the journey, knowing that the first step away from the lake's edge will begin to disturb the perfect stillness that makes this reflection possible, there comes a moment of profound recognition. The face in the water is not separate from the world that surrounds it, but intimately connected to it, framed by sky and trees, illuminated by natural light, existing only in relationship to the larger environment that makes reflection possible. This recognition transforms the entire experience from one of narcissistic self-absorption to something more like ecological self-awareness, an understanding of oneself as part of the larger web of existence, while simultaneously being a unique conscious perspective from which that web can be observed and appreciated. The traveler sees in the reflection not just an isolated individual, but a point of consciousness through which the universe becomes aware of itself. With this understanding, the traveler takes a single step back from the water's edge, and the movement creates the first small disturbance in the air that begins to ripple across the lake's surface. The perfect reflection wavers, fragments, and reconstitutes itself in new patterns, but the essential recognition remains. Consciousness has encountered itself in its full complexity, both subject and object, both observer and observed, both separate from the world and inextricably part of it. Part 9, the solitary tree. Leaving the lake and its perfect mirror behind, the traveler carries forward a profound experience of self-encounter, but the journey does not allow for extended contemplation of that revelation. The terrain beyond the water becomes increasingly challenging, rising through a series of natural terraces carved into the hillside by centuries of erosion and root growth. The forest here seems older still, if such a thing is possible, not just ancient in years, but ancient in some more fundamental sense, as if these woods have existed so long that they have learned secrets about the art being that younger forests have not yet discovered. The trees grow more sparsely as the traveler climbs, not from any lack of fertility in the soil, but seemingly by choice, as if each massive trunk has claimed a territory appropriate to its dignity and refuses to crowd its neighbors. The canopy, while still thick enough to filter most direct sunlight, admits more illumination than the deeper forest below, creating a cathedral-like atmosphere where shafts of golden light slant through the green shadows at dramatic angles, illuminating patches of forest floor with an almost theatrical intensity. It is in this context of increasing spaciousness and grandeur that the traveler first glimpses what appears to be a clearing ahead. Not the perfectly circular opening of the earlier empty space, but something more irregular and organic, a natural amphitheater carved from the forest by forces that seem more purposeful than accidental. As the approach continues, this clearing reveals itself to be dominated by a single presence so overwhelming that it transforms the entire character of the landscape around it. At the center of this natural arena stands a tree of such immense proportions that it defies easy comprehension. It is not simply large in a way that old trees can be large, impressive, but ultimately measurable. This tree exists on a scale that seems to belong to mythology rather than botany, its trunk so massive that its far side disappears into visual perspective, its height so great that its crown is lost in a canopy that seems to exist in a different atmosphere than the ground below. The traveler approaches this giant with something approaching awe, recognizing immediately that this is not simply another forest tree that happens to be unusually large, but a being of entirely different order, a presence that has achieved something approaching geological status, existing more like a natural feature of the landscape than like a living organism. The bark alone tells stories of centuries weathered and survived, deep furrows and ridges that create a topography complex enough to support its own ecosystem of mosses, lichens, and small ferns that have made their homes in the crevices and hollows of this vast living surface. But what strikes a traveler most forcefully is not the tree's size, impressive as that is, but its profound solitude. In every other part of the forest, trees have grown in community, not necessarily touching, but clearly in relationship, sharing resources through underground fungal networks, creating microclimates that benefit their neighbors, participating in the complex web of mutual dependence that characterizes healthy woodland ecosystems. This tree stands alone, not because no other trees could survive in its vicinity, but because it has chosen a different path, one that requires complete self-reliance and absolute authenticity to its own nature. The circle of open space that surrounds a great tree extends for perhaps 50 yards in every direction, creating a natural boundary that other trees seem to respect rather than challenge. Within this circle, the forest floor is carpeted with the tree's own leaves, massive, distinctive foliage that clearly belongs to no other species in the surrounding woodland. These fallen leaves have created their own soil over the centuries, a rich, dark earth that supports unique plant communities adapted specifically to particular conditions that exist in the shadow and shelter of this singular giant. Walking slowly around the tree's perimeter, trying to comprehend its full dimensions, the traveler becomes aware that this solitude is not the result of rejection or failure to connect with the forest community. The tree's isolation appears to be a choice, a deliberate embrace of a way of being that requires complete self-knowledge and absolute fidelity to one's own essential nature, regardless of the social cost such authenticity might entail. There is something almost heroic about this solitary stance, a quiet dignity that speaks of centuries spent developing an identity independent of external validation or support. The philosophical implications of this encounter begin to unfold as the traveler settles into contemplation at the base of the great trunk, leaning against bark that feels more like stone than wood, so dense and weather has become through its long dialogue with time and weather. Martin Heidegger would have recognized in this tree a perfect example of authentic being, existence that has achieved complete fidelity to its own essence, that has refused to lose itself in what he called the they-self, the comfortable conformity that allows beings to avoid the anxiety and responsibility of genuine selfhood. The tree has not grown to please others or to fit predetermined expectations about what trees should be. It has not modified its development to accommodate neighbors or to conform to the average patterns that characterize its species. Instead, it has grown according to some inner logic that appears to be entirely its own, reaching dimensions that other trees of its kind never achieve, not because they lack the potential, but because they lack the courage or commitment to pursue that potential to its ultimate expression. This authenticity comes at a cost that becomes increasingly apparent the longer the traveler contemplates the tree's situation. The solitude is real and profound. This tree will never experience the intimate root sharing that allows forest trees to support each other during droughts or nutrient shortages. It will never benefit from the wind protection that trees provide for each other by growing in groves. It must weather every storm alone, generate all its own resources, create its own microclimate without assistance from neighbors who could share the burden. Yet this isolation also creates possibilities that would be impossible within constraints of forest community. The tree has been free to explore the full potential of its genetic heritage without compromise, to develop characteristics that might be suppressed or modified in response to neighboring trees' needs. Its crown spreads with perfect symmetry because no nearby trees force it to compete for light. Its root system extends without conflict because no other major trees share its territory. Its growth has been limited only by soil, climate, and its own internal capacity, not by the need to negotiate space and resources with competitors. The traveler begins to understand that what appears to be mere size is actually the visible expression of something much more profound, a completeness of self-development that is rarely achieved by beings who must constantly adapt their growth to accommodate the needs and expectations of others. The tree's immensity reflects not just physical expansion, but the full realization of its own unique potential, unconstrained by external pressures to conform or compromise. This recognition creates a complex emotional response in the traveler. There is admiration for the tree's extraordinary achievement, its refusal to settle for the comfortable mediocrity that characterizes most existence. But there's also a kind of sadness for the price that such authenticity requires, the inevitable loneliness that comes from choosing to be fully oneself rather than partially acceptable to others. The tree's grandeur is inseparable from its isolation, its magnificence achieved only through its willingness to stand apart from the community that might have provided comfort and connection. As afternoon light slants through the clearing, illuminating the tree's massive trunk with golden fire, the traveler notices details that have been invisible from a distance. The bark is not uniform but varies in texture and pattern across the tree's surface, as if different sections have adapted to different environmental pressures over the centuries. Some areas are smooth and almost polished, while others are deeply furrowed and rough. Some sections show the circular scars where branches once grew, but were eventually shed as the tree's priorities evolved and changed. These variations tell the story of a being that has not remained static in its solitude, but has continued to grow and adapt, making choices about what aspects of itself to cultivate and what elements to release. The tree has not achieved authenticity by finding some fixed, essential identity and rigidly maintaining it, but by remaining faithful to an ongoing process of becoming, of responding to changing conditions while never betraying its fundamental nature. This dynamic understanding of authenticity resonates deeply with existentialist philosophy. Jean-Paul Sartre would have recognized in this tree an example of what he called radical freedom, the continuous responsibility to create oneself through choices and actions without the false comfort of believing in predetermined essences or unchanging identities. The tree has been free to become what it is because it has been willing to bear the full responsibility for that becoming, without relying on external authorities to validate its choices or provide templates for its development. The silence that surrounds the tree is different from any quiet the traveler has experienced elsewhere in the forest. It is not the expectant silence of the empty clearing or the oppressive silence that followed the disappearance of civilization's noise. This is a silence of completion, of a being so fully realized that it needs nothing external to validate or enhance its existence. The tree does not call for attention or response. It simply exists in its own fullness, complete and self-contained. Yet, paradoxically, this silence speaks more eloquently than any words could. It communicates the possibility of achieving a kind of selfhood that does not depend on others' recognition or approval, that does not require constant external validation to maintain its sense of worth and purpose. The tree's presence suggests that it is possible to be simultaneously alone and whole, isolated and complete, independent and deeply connected to the fundamental forces that govern existence. As the traveler circles the great trunk again, trying to absorb the full impact of this encounter, the bark seems to take on the character of ancient text, its furrows and ridges forming a kind of natural scripture that records a tree's long dialogue with time, weather, and its own evolving nature. Each ring of growth visible in broken sections tells a story of choices made and sustained, of responses to drought and plenty, of adaptations to changing conditions that never compromise the tree's essential character. The root system, though largely invisible beneath the forest floor, reveals its presence through the subtle undulations in the ground around the tree's base. These massive roots extend far beyond the tree's crown, creating a network of support and resource gathering that is entirely self-sufficient. The tree has learned to be its own ecosystem, generating the conditions it needs for continued growth and health without depending on the mutual support systems that sustain smaller, more social trees. This self-sufficiency extends to the tree's relationship with other forest life. The traveler notices that while the tree stands apart from other trees, it does not stand apart from the forest ecosystem entirely. Birds nest in its branches, insects shelter in its bark. Small mammals make their homes among its roots. The tree's authenticity does not require rejecting all relationships, but rather creating relationships on its own terms, offering what it chooses to offer without compromising its essential nature. This selective engagement with others represents perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of the tree's authenticity. It has not achieved selfhood through total withdrawal from all connection, but through conscious choice about what forms of relationship serve both its own nature and the broader ecosystem of which it remains a part. The tree gives shelter and support to countless other beings, but it does so as an expression of its own abundance rather than from a need to be needed or accepted. The light continues to change as the day advances, and the traveler becomes aware that this encounter with a solitary tree is approaching its natural conclusion. But the lessons embedded in this meeting feel profound and lasting. The tree has demonstrated that authenticity is not a static achievement, but an ongoing process of remaining faithful to one's deepest nature while continuing to grow and respond to changing conditions. More importantly, the tree has shown that solitude need not mean loneliness, that independence need not mean isolation from all meaningful connection. The great tree stands alone but not apart, separate but not severed from the larger web of existence that sustains and is sustained by its unique presence. As the traveler prepares to leave this natural cathedral, there comes a moment of profound recognition. The tree's example suggests that authentic existence might require periods of profound solitude, not as rejection in community, but as necessary preparation for genuine community. Time spent developing the kind of complete selfhood that has something valuable to offer rather than merely needs to be filled. The tree's silence continues as the traveler departs, but it is a silence that will echo long after this clearing is left behind. It is a silence of being so completely oneself that no words are needed to justify or explain that existence. It is a silence of authenticity achieved and maintained regardless of external validation or approval. Walking away from the great tree's presence, the traveler carries forward a new understanding of what it might mean to live authentically, not as a rejection of relationship and community, but as a preparation for relationship and community that serves both individual flourishing and collective well-being. The solitary tree has shown that sometimes the greatest gift we can offer the world is the courage to become fully ourselves, regardless of how isolated such becoming might initially make us feel. The forest path beckons ahead, but the memory of the tree's magnificent solitude will inform every step of the journey that remains, a living reminder that authenticity is always possible for those willing to bear its costs and embrace its profound, necessary solitude. Part 10, The Invisible Exit. The departure from the solitary tree's presence marks a subtle but significant shift in the quality of the traveler's movement through the forest. Where previous stages of the journey have been characterized by increasing depth and complexity, each encounter drawing consciousness further into the mysteries of existence. This final phase begins with an almost imperceptible sense of emergence, as if the journey has reached some invisible apex and begun its return trajectory toward a world beyond the forest's boundaries. At first, this shift is barely noticeable. The trees remain ancient and massive. The canopy still filters sunlight into those familiar shafts of golden illumination. The forest floor continues its soft carpet of decomposing leaves and emergent growth. But gradually, almost subliminally, the traveler becomes aware that something fundamental is changing in the woodland's character. The spaces between trees grow fractionally larger. The canopy admits slightly more direct light. The undergrowth takes on varieties of plant life that suggest transitional ecosystems rather than the deep forest communities that had characterized the journey's heart. This transformation occurs so gradually that it becomes apparent only in retrospect, like the way dawn arrives not as a sudden illumination, but as an imperceptible brightening that reveals itself only when one realizes that what had been darkness is now unmistakably light. The traveler continues walking, following what instinct and terrain suggest as the most natural route, but without the sense of deliberate penetration into mystery that had characterized the earlier phases of the journey. Where once every step had seemed to lead deeper into the unknown, now movement feels more like a gentle surfacing, a gradual return from depths that have been explored as thoroughly as consciousness could manage. The forest is not releasing its hold reluctantly, but rather seems to be gently guiding the traveler toward whatever lies beyond its boundaries, like a wise teacher who knows when a lesson has been fully absorbed and the student is ready to move on to different forms of learning. The philosophical weight of the encounters remains present. The memory of the empty clearing's profound void, the shifting shadows that revealed identity's fluid nature, the boulder that forced confrontation with limit situations, the mysterious voice that embodied existence's fundamental ambiguity, the lake's perfect reflection that enabled genuine self-encounter, and most recently, the solitary tree's demonstration of what authentic existence might require. These experiences have not faded but have begun to integrate into something resembling wisdom rather than mere accumulation of intense experiences. As the traveler continues this gradual emergence, the quality of thought itself seems to change. Where the journey's earlier stages had generated urgent questions and demanded immediate intellectual engagement with complex philosophical problems, this final phase creates space for a different kind of reflection, less analytical, more synthetic, concerned not with solving the mysteries encountered, but with learning to live creatively with their permanent irresolution. The path, which had long since ceased to be any kind of formal trail, now becomes even more impressionistic. existing more as a tendency in the landscape than as any definite route. The traveler follows subtle gradients in elevation, natural corridors between stands trees, the logic of water flow and geological formation, rather than any human-created infrastructure. This pathlessness no longer generates the anxiety it produced earlier in the journey. Instead, it feels like a final lesson in the art of navigation without predetermined destination, movement guided by attention to present conditions rather than adherence to fixed plans. It is during this phase of gentle emergence that the traveler begins to notice the first definitive signs that the forest is preparing to end. These signs do not announce themselves dramatically, but reveal themselves to consciousness that has been educated by the journey to notice subtleties that would have been invisible to the urban-trained awareness that first approached the forest's edge. A particular quality of light suggests open sky not far ahead. The composition of plant life includes species that typically grow in edge habitats where forest meets field or meadow. The acoustic environment subtly shifts to include sounds that carry farther distances, suggesting spaces larger than those found in deep woodland. But perhaps the most significant indicator of approaching emergence is internal rather than external, a growing sense of completion that does not depend on having arrived at any particular destination. The traveler realizes that the forest has given what it had to give, that the encounters it offered have been fully received and absorbed, and that continuing to wander in its depths would now be mere repetition rather than genuine exploration. The education that this wilderness offered has reached its natural conclusion, not because all questions have been answered, but because consciousness has been prepared to engage with questions in an entirely new way. This recognition brings with it a complex emotional response. There is relief at the prospect of returning to the familiar world with its predictable challenges and comfortable routines. The intensity of constant existential confrontation, while valuable, has been exhausting in ways that only become apparent as its pressure begins to lift. The mind looks forward to engaging with problems that have definite solutions, situations that offer clear choices between better and worse alternatives, relationships with other people that provide the comfort of shared assumptions and mutual understanding. But there is also a profound sadness at the prospect of leaving behind this realm, where every moment had carried the weight of philosophical significance, where consciousness had been called to operate at its highest levels of attention and creativity. The forest had demanded nothing less than complete authenticity, absolute presence, total engagement with the deepest questions that existence poses to aware beings. Returning to the ordinary world means accepting reduction in this intensity, a necessary but painful compromise with the demands of practical life. Most complex of all is a growing recognition that the journey has not provided the kind of answers that the traveler had unconsciously expected when first approaching the forest's edge. The gate of mist had seemed to promise revelation. The path had appeared to lead toward some form of enlightenment. The various encounters had suggested that persistence would eventually yield the kind of understanding that would resolve fundamental uncertainties about meaning, purpose, and identity. Instead, the forest has offered something both more and less than answers, a transformation in the quality of questioning itself. The mysteries that had driven the traveler into the wilderness remain mysteries, but they no longer feel like problems to be solved. They have become, instead, the permanent conditions of authentic existence, not obstacles to be overcome, but the very medium within which genuine life must be lived. The forest has taught not resolution but acceptance, not clarity but comfort with ambiguity, not certainty but courage in the face of permanent uncertainty. This transformation becomes more apparent as the signs of approaching forest edge grow stronger. The traveler realizes that the questions that had seemed so urgent at the journey's beginning— who am I? What is the meaning of existence? How should I live? Have not been answered so much as rendered irrelevant in their original form. The self that posed those questions no longer exists in quite the same way, having been reconstructed through each encounter with the forest teachings. The questions themselves have evolved from demands for definitive information into ongoing invitations for creative engagement with the mystery of being conscious in an ambiguous universe. The lightening of the canopy becomes more pronounced as the traveler continues forward, and now patches of genuine open sky become visible through the thinning leaves. These glimpses of space beyond the forest create a sense of anticipation, but it is anticipation of a different quality than what had characterized the journey's beginning. Rather than expecting to discover something external that would complete or fulfill the quest, the traveler now looks forward to the opportunity to test what had been learned. to see how the forest's teachings will inform engagement with the world beyond its boundaries. The edge, when it finally arrives, does so without announcement or ceremony. There is no gate corresponding to the twisted archway that had marked the forest's entrance, no threshold that demands conscious decision to cross. Instead, the trees simply become gradually more sparse. The spaces between them expand naturally, and at some point that can be identified only in retrospect, the traveler realizes that they are no longer within the forest, but standing in the open meadow that borders its eastern edge. This transition's gentleness feels significant in itself. The forest does not release its visitors with dramatic finality, but allows them to emerge naturally, carrying its teachings with them rather than leaving them behind at some artificial boundary. The education continues even after the classroom has been left behind, integrated into consciousness in ways that will inform all future encounters with existence's fundamental questions. Standing in the meadow, looking back at the forest edge, the traveler experiences a moment of profound disorientation. The trees that form the woodland's boundary appear utterly ordinary from this external perspective. Impressive in their size and age, certainly, but lacking any visible indication of the extraordinary encounters that lie within their depths. To anyone who had not made the interior journey, this would appear to be simply a large stand of old-growth forest, remarkable perhaps for its preservation, but offering no hint of its philosophical significance. This external ordinariness of what had been so internally transformative creates another lesson about the relationship between appearance and reality, between external circumstances and internal experience. The forest's power to catalyze existential awakening had depended not on any magical properties it possessed, but on the quality of attention and openness that consciousness brought to its encounters with natural processes and phenomena. The same trees, paths, clearings, and encounters might be experienced by other travelers as merely scenic beauty or interesting wildlife habitat, depending on their readiness to engage with the deeper questions that arise when human consciousness finds itself alone with the fundamental conditions of existence. The afternoon light falling across the meadow creates a sense of temporal location that had been largely absent during the forest journey. Here, the sun's position clearly indicates the hour. The quality of light suggests the season. The visible horizon provides geographical orientation. After the timeless quality of the deep forest, where one moment could feel like hours and hours could pass like moments, this return of measurable time creates both comfort and a subtle sense of confinement. The traveler begins to walk across the meadow toward what appears to be a road or path that will presumably lead back to the ordinary world of human community and conventional purposes. Each step away from the forest edge feels like a small farewell, not just to a place that has been temporarily visited, but to a way of being that cannot be sustained indefinitely within the constraints of social existence. The intensity of existential engagement that the forest had demanded and supported is not compatible with the compromises and partial attention that ordinary life requires. But this farewell is not a loss or failure. The traveler carries forward a transformed relationship to the very questions that had initiated the journey. The mystery of existence remains mysterious, but it is no longer experienced as a problem requiring solution. Instead, it has become the permanent backdrop against which all specific choices and actions take place. Not an obstacle to clear living, but the very condition that makes authentic choice possible. The visible road approaches, and with it the inevitable return to a world of schedules, obligations, relationships, and practical problems. But the consciousness that will engage with these familiar challenges has been fundamentally altered by its journey through the forest of existential encounter. The questions will be the same, but the questioner has been transformed. The mysteries persist, but the capacity to live creatively within mystery has been developed and strengthened. As the meadow ends and the road begins, the traveler pauses for one final look back at the forest edge. The trees stand in their ancient patience, holding within their depth the same encounters, the same opportunities for awakening, the same invitations to authentic existence that they have offered for countless years to anyone willing to venture beyond the comfortable boundaries of predetermined meaning. The forest will remain, ready for the next consciousness brave enough to face the gate of mist and enter into genuine dialogue with the fundamental conditions of being human in an ambiguous universe. And the traveler will carry forward, not answers to existence's deepest questions, but something far more valuable, the capacity to engage with those questions as creative opportunities rather than problems to be solved, as invitations to ongoing growth rather than demands for immediate resolution. The road stretches ahead, leading back to the world of human community and shared purposes. But now it is a road traveled by consciousness that has learned to embrace mystery as the foundation of authentic existence rather than its enemy. The journey ends, but the transformation as catalyzed continues, informing every step of the path that lies ahead.